Welcome to the world of TrendPod AI. Today we're taking a deep dive into India's projected economic rise. The big news is that by the end of fiscal year 2025-26, India is expected to overtake Japan, becoming the world's fourth largest economy.
That's right. It's a headline grabber.
Definitely. And our guide for this is an insightful piece from the Economic Times called India's Economy May Overtake Japan Soon, but with caveats. So our mission today really is to get behind those headlines for you. We want to understand, why this shift is happening, what it actually means, and importantly, what are those caveats we need to keep in mind?
Absolutely. Because that projection, becoming number 4, it's definitely noteworthy, especially when you consider the speed, right? The Economic Times piece points out India was 10th, just 10th largest back in 2014.
Wow, yeah.
So jumping to 4th in just over a decade, that's a really rapid transformation.
It really is. Let's unpack that speed. A 6th-place jump in 11 years. That's significant. The article mentions a 105% nominal GDP growth over that time, puts India at a projected $4 trillion economy in 2025. That kind of momentum, well, it demands a closer look.
It really does. And what's quite fascinating, I think, is that this growth is expected even with, a pretty choppy global economic scene. The article mentions ongoing uncertainties, geopolitical stuff, potential trade issues.
Right, all that's swirling around.
Exactly. And yet India is still projected to be the fastest growing major world economy. The forecast is 6.2% GDP growth for 2025.
It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? When you look at the wider world, the Economic Times even gives some longer-term context. Between 1990 and 2023, India's average annual growth is about 6.7%. That outpaced the US, Germany, Japan, established players. That sort of sustained performance, well, it sets the stage for where we are now.
It does. It provides a strong base, but like the title says, with caveats. And this is where it gets perhaps more complex because the overall size of the economy, while it's a key number, doesn't automatically mean, economic well-being for everyone in the country.
Right. And here's where it gets, I think, really interesting and maybe more relevant to your everyday life if you're listening. The article points out that despite this really impressive overall growth, India's per capita GDP, so the average economic output per person, is still relatively low. $2,880, according to the IMF.
Yeah, and the comparison is quite stark. Look at China, around $13,690 per capita. Japan, way higher at $33,960. It's a huge difference. It just underlines that while India's total economic pie is getting much bigger, the individual slices are still, comparatively small.
And the article doesn't mince words. It says India doesn't even rank in the top 100 countries for GDP per capita, not even with PPP adjustments, purchasing power parity.
Yeah.
That really forces you, the listener, to look past those big flashy headline numbers.
Exactly. So why? Why this gap between the total GDP and the per capita figure? Well, the article touches on the main reason. India's huge population, roughly 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, that's a big denominator.
It is. So even really significant overall economic growth gets, diluted when you divide it by that many people.
Makes total sense. And the article also highlights some, let's say, structural things feeding into this. One big one is how much informal employment there is. It says about 90% of the workforce. That's huge.
It's massive. And informal work often means, lower pay, fewer benefits, less security. All that hits per capita income directly. And there's another key factor I mentioned, the low rate of women participating in the workforce, just 26% in India.
Compared to what globally?
The global average is around 47%, so India is significantly lower. And when a big chunk of your potential workforce isn't fully engaged, that naturally holds back both the overall economy and individual income growth.
So it feels like the engine's revving, but maybe not all the gears are fully engaged yet or benefiting everyone equally. But the article does offer some brighter spots, some hope, right?
It does, yeah. It's important to note, per capita income has nearly doubled in the last 10 years. The article suggests this growth is keeping pace with the overall GDP rise, partly because population growth is slowing down a bit.
Okay, that's positive.
It is, but it also adds a crucial point. These gains aren't spread evenly across the country. There are regional differences.
Right, disparities exist. And looking ahead, the big picture GDP numbers still look optimistic.
Yes, the trajectory seems set for more expansion. The article mentions projections of India hitting a $5 trillion economy in 2027 and potentially becoming the world's third largest, overtaking Germany maybe in 2028.
So the potential is definitely there.
Absolutely. But, and this is a big but, stressed by the experts in the piece, this continued growth isn't guaranteed. It needs ongoing, effective reforms.
Right, you can't just coast. The article points to several key areas needing attention, based on what experts are saying. Ranan Banerjee from PwC talks about needing reforms that really help private businesses thrive, maybe decriminalizing some minor compliance issues, using tech to make compliance easier.
Makes sense. He also mentions boosting exports, especially helping smaller businesses, MSMEs, with things like shared facilities, and crucially, keep investing in infrastructure to cut down logistics costs. That's a big deal for competitiveness.
Definitely. Then there's Sachidanand Shukla from L&T, who calls for really deep reforms.
Yeah.
Agriculture, labor laws, education, skilling.
Foundational stuff.
Yeah, and even judicial, administrative, police systems. These are the bedrock things for long-term progress.
Absolutely. And Radhika Rao from DBS Bank brings it back to jobs. She stresses the vital need to boost employment generation. That's key to improving the quality of growth, making sure it translates into better incomes for more people. It tackles that per capita challenge head on.
It really ties it all together, doesn't it? Reaching number 4 is one thing, but making sure that growth is felt more widely is the real task. The article also briefly touches on India's growing global importance, too.
Yes, it mentions India becoming an increasingly crucial market for big players like the US and China. And that relative political stability, plus the reform drive over the last decade or so, that's apparently boosted global investor confidence.
Okay, so pulling it all together then, it seems like hitting 4th place is a major milestone, yes, but maybe it's more like reaching a new base camp. The article really concludes by saying, look, for this growth to truly benefit more people, the real focus has to be on creating enough good jobs, especially for young people.
Right. And building up a strong manufacturing sector, that provides that sustained, stable progress.
So the overall GDP growth sort of creates the potential.
Exactly, it provides the platform. But it's those targeted efforts jobs, structural reforms that are needed to really lift per capita incomes and improve quality of life for the average person.
Okay, so just to recap our deep dive for you. India's climb up the global economic ranks. Impressive, no doubt, shows real overall expansion, but that lower per capita GDP, the structural things like informal work, lower female participation, it shows the story is, well, much more complex than just the headline rank.
Absolutely.
It really hammers home why you need to look at both the overall GDP and the per capita GDP to get a real sense of a nation's economic health and prosperity.
Couldn't agree more. The size of the pie is one thing, but how it's sliced and who gets a piece matters immensely.
On that note then, thinking about all these factors,
Yeah.
what do you think is the single most critical reform India needs to make sure this impressive growth actually translates into real, tangible improvements in people's lives? Something for you to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for watching TrendPod AI.